They said the house had been demolished years ago. They said nothing remained except an empty field beyond the willow trees. Then, the fog arrived, and when it lifted, Carrington Hall had returned. Its family vanished more than 20 years ago. Yet someone was still playing the piano, and someone was waiting at the upstairs window. Welcome back to Short Ghost Stories, long after midnight. The house at Willow End. The rain began shortly after sunset. Benjamin Grant watched the drops race one another down the carriage window as the road wound deeper into the forest. The last village had vanished nearly an hour earlier. Since then, there had been nothing but trees, ancient trees. Their trunks rose like pillars from the darkness, their roots twisting through the earth like the bones of something buried long ago. The branches met high above the road, forming a black canopy that swallowed what little light remained in the evening sky. The carriage lamps illuminated only a few yards ahead, revealing wet leaves, muddy ruts, and occasional stretches of pale mist drifting between the trunks. Everything beyond that narrow circle of light remained hidden. Benjamin shifted uneasily in his seat. He was not a superstitious man. During his years as a schoolmaster, he had heard every sort of ghost story imaginable. Entire countries seemed determined to frighten themselves with tales of haunted roads and wandering spirits. There was something about this forest that unsettled him. Perhaps it was the silence. Rain fell steadily. The wheels rolled through mud. The horse breathed heavily. Yet, somehow the forest itself seemed silent. No birds, no insects. No rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth. Nothing. As though the woods were listening. The driver sat hunched beneath his coat, saying little. Benjamin had attempted conversation several times during the journey and received only brief replies in return. Now, even those had ceased. The horse suddenly tossed its head. The carriage lurched. "What is it?" Benjamin called. The driver glanced toward the trees. "Nothing." But his voice lacked conviction. The horse slowed, its ears flattened. For several seconds it seemed unwilling to continue. The driver snapped the reins. "Move on." The animal obeyed reluctantly. Benjamin frowned. "You seem nervous." The driver spat into the darkness. "I don't like this road after sunset." "Why?" No answer came. Benjamin leaned closer to the window. Mist drifted between the trees. At first it appeared ordinary enough. Then he noticed something peculiar. The fog was not moving with the wind. It stood motionless among the trunks. Tall, pale shapes, almost human in outline, watching. Benjamin blinked. The shapes dissolved at once. Only mist, nothing more. A sensible man must be careful when he allows himself to imagine. The carriage continued. The darkness deepened. Then, without warning, a sound drifted through the forest. A piano. one soft note, clear as a bell. Benjamin sat upright. The note lingered, faded. Then another followed. A simple melody, distant, melancholy, entirely impossible. He pushed open the small window behind the driver. "Did you hear that?" The man stiffened. "Hear what?" "The piano." The driver snapped the window shut. Benjamin stared. The melody continued for several moments before fading completely. After that, neither man spoke. The forest seemed darker than before. At length, the trees began to thin. Cold air swept across open ground. The carriage emerged from the woodland and onto a narrow road bordered by fields. Far ahead, a handful of yellow lights glimmered through the mist. The village. Willow End. Benjamin felt unexpectedly relieved. The driver slowed the horse. Moments later, they reached a small stone bridge spanning a shallow stream. There, the carriage stopped. Benjamin looked around. The village is still ahead. Aye. Then why are we stopping? The driver climbed down. Because this is where I leave you. Benjamin laughed. You cannot be serious. The man removed the luggage from the rear of the carriage. I don't cross this bridge after dark. What nonsense is that? The driver avoided his gaze. Best walk the rest. It is raining. It is not far. Benjamin stepped down reluctantly. The driver handed him his case. Within seconds, he had turned the carriage around. The horse required no encouragement. It departed at once. Benjamin watched the carriage disappear toward the forest. The driver never looked back. For a long moment, he stood alone beside the bridge. Rain whispered across the fields. Mist drifted low over the ground. Ahead lay Willow End. Behind him stretched the dark road disappearing into the woods. Then, faintly, from somewhere far within those trees, he heard a single piano note again. Benjamin turned sharply. The forest stood silent, empty. He could not shake the feeling that something had followed him to the edge of the village. Something waiting beyond the darkness. He adjusted his coat and continued toward the lights. The fox and thistle stood beside the churchyard wall. It was an old inn, timber-framed and slightly crooked with age. Warm yellow light glowed from its windows, casting narrow rectangles across the wet road. For the first time since entering the forest, Benjamin felt some measure of comfort. He stepped inside. The warmth hit him immediately. A fire burned in the hearth. 3 men occupied a table near the window. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered woman polishing glasses. She looked up as Benjamin entered. "You'll be Mr. Grant?" "I am." "Martha Briggs." She nodded toward the register. "Sign there." Benjamin complied. The innkeeper studied him for a moment. "You came through the forest after dark?" "Yes." A strange expression crossed her face. "Not many do." The men by the window exchanged glances. Benjamin noticed it immediately. Something was wrong. The atmosphere inside the inn felt strained, expectant, as though everyone had been waiting for news. Before he could ask, the church clock outside struck 8. The room fell silent. One of the men stood abruptly. "Good night." The others followed. Within moments, the parlor was nearly empty. Benjamin watched them leave. "Friendly place," Martha snorted. "They'll talk tomorrow." "Why not tonight?" The innkeeper glanced toward the window. Beyond the glass, the fog thickened. "You arrived on the wrong evening." Benjamin looked outside. "What is special about tonight?" For several seconds, Martha said nothing. Then she shook her head. "Nothing you'll believe." Benjamin smiled. "Try me." The innkeeper set down her glass. "Have you ever heard of Carrington Hall?" The name meant nothing to him. "No." "Then perhaps that's for the best." Before Benjamin could question her further, a shout erupted outside. Then another. A door slammed. Footsteps pounded along the road. Martha hurried toward the entrance. Benjamin followed. Several villagers had gathered in the lane. All were staring toward the far end of the village, toward the willow field. The fog rolled thick and white across the landscape. Someone pointed. "There!" Benjamin squinted. At first he saw nothing. Then the mist shifted, and his breath caught in his throat. A house stood beyond the willows. A great Victorian manor. Dark, silent, impossible. For several moments, nobody spoke. The villagers simply stared. The house appeared ancient, weathered, as though it had stood there for generations. Yet the expressions around him told a different story. "What is it?" Benjamin asked. No one answered. Finally, Martha Briggs spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Carrington Hall." Benjamin looked at her. "You know this house?" Martha nodded slowly. Then she said something that made no sense whatsoever. And somewhere deep inside the fog, beyond the willows, a faint piano melody began to play. The piano melody drifted across the field for only a few seconds before fading into silence. No one moved. The villagers remained standing in the road, staring toward the manor as though afraid that looking away might somehow allow it to come closer. Benjamin studied the house carefully. Even through the fog, he could make out remarkable details. The steep slate roof, the tall chimneys, the ivy climbing one side of the brickwork, the front porch with its heavy columns. Nothing about it appeared unreal. Nothing suggested an illusion. It stood solidly upon the earth, exactly where the villagers claimed nothing had stood the day before. "Who owned it?" Benjamin finally asked. No one answered. Several people turned away. Others began walking back toward their homes. The gathering dissolved with surprising speed. Within moments, only Martha Briggs remained beside him. The innkeeper kept her eyes fixed on the manor. "I haven't seen it since I was a girl," she said quietly. "You've seen it before?" "Before they tore it down." Benjamin glanced at her. And you truly believe that's the same house? I know it is. How? The porch lanterns. Benjamin looked again. 2 lanterns hung on either side of the front door. Dark now, motionless. What about them? They've always been there. The innkeeper's expression tightened. My grandmother used to say she could recognize Carrington Hall from 5 miles away just by those lanterns. A cold wind swept across the road. The fog shifted. For an instant, Benjamin thought he saw movement in one of the upper windows. A pale shape. A face, perhaps. Then it vanished. He rubbed his eyes. Nothing remained. Only darkness. Come inside, Martha said. Why? Because it will be midnight soon. Benjamin almost laughed. And? The innkeeper met his gaze. Because nothing good ever happens near that house after midnight. The following morning dawned gray and wet. Benjamin slept poorly. Several times during the night he had awakened with the peculiar sensation that someone was standing outside his room, listening. Each time he opened the door and found the hallway empty. After breakfast, he decided to visit the field. The villagers watched him leave. No one attempted to stop him. That, somehow, was more unsettling than if they had. The road wound through low grass and scattered willow trees. As he approached the manor, its size became increasingly apparent. From the village, it had seemed merely large. Up close, it was enormous. 3 stories, nearly 40 windows. Broad stone steps leading to a pair of heavy oak doors. The building possessed the silent confidence of great age, yet something about it felt wrong. Benjamin could not immediately identify what. Then he realized there were no signs of weathering. Not really. The bricks were old, the windows dusty, the iron gate rusted, yet everything appeared frozen, as though time had touched the house once and then forgotten to continue. The gate stood open. Benjamin entered. The gravel path crunched beneath his boots. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed reluctant to cross the property. At the foot of the porch steps, he paused. The brass plate beside the door remained visible beneath decades of tarnish. Carrington Hall. He raised the iron knocker. The sound echoed through the house. Deep, hollow, endless. No answer came. He tried the handle. The door opened immediately. The entrance hall beyond was vast. A broad staircase rose toward the upper floors. Portraits lined the walls. Dust covered every surface. Yet once again Benjamin felt that peculiar contradiction. The house looked abandoned, but not empty. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows. Its pale beams illuminated countless particles drifting in the air. Benjamin stepped forward. The door closed behind him. The sound echoed through the manor. He found himself listening, waiting. Nothing. Only silence. To his left stood a drawing room. To his right, a library. Ahead lay a long corridor disappearing into shadow. Benjamin entered the library first. Hundreds of books still occupied the shelves. Most were covered in dust. One was not. He noticed it immediately. The dust around it remained undisturbed. The book itself looked recently handled. Benjamin frowned. He crossed the room, touched the cover. The leather felt cold, not unusual. Yet, as he withdrew his hand, he noticed something else. The dust upon the table had not settled evenly. Someone had moved the book recently. A ridiculous thought entered his mind. Perhaps another curious villager had visited. Yet somehow that explanation felt insufficient. The room carried no signs of human presence. No footprints. No disturbed furniture. Nothing. He opened the book. The pages contained poetry. Victorian love poems. Several passages had been marked lightly in pencil. One line caught his attention. Some houses remember more faithfully than men. Benjamin stared at the sentence, then laughed quietly. Coincidence, nothing more. He closed the book. A sound echoed somewhere upstairs. Footsteps. Soft. Deliberate. Benjamin froze. The sound came again. One step, then another, moving slowly across the upper floor. His heartbeat quickened. "Hello?" he called. No answer. He waited. Nothing. Perhaps part of the house settling, old wood contracting. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Yet reason felt strangely fragile within Carrington Hall. He left the library and crossed the entrance hall. At the base of the staircase stood a grandfather clock. Its dark wooden case towered above him. The pendulum hung motionless. Benjamin examined the face. The hands indicated 11:47. Odd. He checked his pocket watch. 10:30. The clock had stopped long ago. Nothing remarkable. Then he noticed another clock, a smaller one above the fireplace. 11:47. His eyes narrowed. He entered the dining room. A third clock stood upon a sideboard. 11:47. A fourth in the morning room. 11:47. Every clock in Carrington Hall displayed the same time. A chill passed through him. The explanation should have been simple. Someone had stopped them deliberately. Yet the uniformity felt strangely deliberate, almost ceremonial. As though the entire house had paused at the exact moment. Benjamin looked toward the staircase. The upper floor waited in silence. Somewhere above him lay the answers, and somewhere beyond those answers lingered the mystery of a family who had vanished more than 20 years earlier without leaving so much as a single trace behind. Taking a deep breath, Benjamin placed one foot upon the first stair. And from somewhere far above, hidden deep within the silent house, a piano began to play. The piano melody drifted through the upper floor like a memory that had forgotten whom it belonged to. Benjamin remained motionless on the staircase. The music was unmistakable now. A slow, sorrowful piece. Not loud, not dramatic, merely present. as though someone sat patiently in another room, unaware they were being overheard. The melody rose and fell for several moments before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the music itself. Benjamin continued climbing. Each step creaked softly beneath his weight. The upper landing stretched before him in a long corridor lined with closed doors and faded portraits. Dust covered the floorboards, yet something immediately caught his attention. There was a single set of footprints. Not recent, not ancient. Simply there. Beginning near the far end of the corridor and disappearing beneath one of the doors. Benjamin stared. They were small. A young woman's, perhaps. He followed them. The corridor seemed longer than it should have been. The farther he walked, the more distant the staircase appeared behind him. Eventually he reached the door. His hand hesitated upon the handle. Then he pushed it open. The room beyond was a music room. A grand piano stood beside a tall window. Dust covered everything. Everything except the piano stool. The dust there had been disturbed. Benjamin approached slowly. On the piano rested a framed photograph. A young woman. Dark hair. Intelligent eyes. 17 years old, perhaps. Rose Carrington. He knew it instantly. Not because her name appeared anywhere, but because she seemed familiar, as though he had seen her somewhere before, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in the window the previous night. Benjamin lifted the photograph. The glass was cold. Then, without warning, the piano played a note. His heart nearly stopped. The key beneath his hand remained untouched. Yet the sound echoed through the room. Another note followed, then another. A melody slowly assembled itself beneath visible fingers. Benjamin stepped backward. The temperature had fallen noticeably. The room darkened. Not gradually, suddenly, as though a cloud had passed before the sun. He turned toward the window. Outside, the sky remained unchanged. The darkness existed only inside the room. And then he saw her. Rose, standing beside the doorway. Not transparent, not monstrous. Simply a young woman in a dark Victorian dress. For several seconds, neither spoke. Benjamin could hear his own heartbeat. Rose regarded him sadly. "You should not have come." Her voice sounded perfectly normal. That frightened him more than any ghostly whisper could have. "Miss Carrington?" She lowered her eyes. "You know my name." "The village remembers." A faint smile touched her face. "No." She looked around the room. "The village remembers the house." The smile faded. "Almost no one remembers us." Benjamin took a cautious step forward. "What happened here?" Rose seemed about to answer. Then her expression changed. Fear. Genuine fear. She turned sharply toward the hallway. "You must leave." "Why?" "It is waking." A distant sound echoed through the manor. A door opening. somewhere below. Then another. Then footsteps. Many footsteps. Benjamin felt the floor vibrating slightly beneath his boots. What is happening? Rose backed toward the far wall. The evening is beginning again. Before he could ask what she meant, she vanished. Not dramatically, not with mist or light. One moment she stood there. The next, the room was empty. Only the piano remained, and the melody had stopped. Benjamin hurried into the corridor. The house had changed. The silence was gone. Voices drifted through the walls. Faint conversations. Laughter. The click of silverware. The crackle of a fire. He hurried toward the staircase. Below him, the entrance hall no longer appeared abandoned. Light flickered from the drawing room. Warm, golden light. Impossible light. Benjamin descended cautiously. The air smelled different now. Freshly cooked food, burning candles, polished wood. The scent of a lived-in house. The scent of 1871. He reached the drawing room doorway and froze. 4 people occupied the room. Arthur Carrington stood near the fireplace reading a newspaper. Eleanor Carrington sat beside the fire with embroidery in her lap. Daniel played on the carpet with a wooden soldier. Rose sat quietly at the piano. Benjamin stared. The family appeared completely alive. Not ghosts, not phantoms. Living people going about an ordinary evening. None of them noticed him. He watched in fascination. The scene unfolded naturally. Arthur commented upon the weather. Eleanor laughed softly. Daniel complained about school. For a brief moment, Benjamin forgot where he was, forgot what he was witnessing. Then Arthur removed his pocket watch. His expression darkened. The clocks have stopped again. The room fell silent. Eleanor looked toward the grandfather clock. Daniel stopped playing. Only Rose seemed unsurprised. Benjamin followed their gaze. Every clock displayed the same time. 11:47. A terrible unease settled over the room. Even the fire seemed quieter. Rose slowly rose from the piano bench. "Father?" Arthur looked toward her. The girl appeared frightened, truly frightened. Then came the knock. 3 slow knocks upon the front door. Every person in the room froze. Benjamin felt his blood turn cold. The sound seemed wrong somehow, too heavy, too deliberate. Not a visitor requesting entry, something announcing its arrival. Arthur crossed the room. "Arthur," Eleanor whispered, but he continued toward the hall. The second knock sounded, louder. The house trembled slightly. Daniel began to cry. Rose looked toward Benjamin. For the first time she saw him. Not the replay, the real Rose. The trapped Rose. Standing behind the memory. "Don't let him open it," she said. Benjamin rushed forward instinctively, but he could not touch them. His hands passed through Arthur's shoulder like smoke. The third knock echoed through the house. Arthur opened the door. Fog poured inside. Not ordinary fog. This moved with purpose, flowing across the floor like living water. The temperature plummeted. Candles flickered. The clocks began ticking wildly. Fast. Far too fast. Benjamin backed away. The fog spread through the hall. The walls seemed to stretch. The ceiling rose higher. Reality itself bent beneath its touch. The Carrington family stood frozen, unable to move, unable to flee. Rose appeared beside Benjamin once more. Not the memory, the real Rose. Her face was pale. It's taking them. What is it? I don't know. Her voice trembled. It came from the fog. The white mist reached Arthur first, his outline blurred. Then Eleanor, then Daniel. One by one, they faded. Not dying, not vanishing, being erased. Like words disappearing from a page. Daniel dropped his wooden soldier. The toy struck the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally. Rose gripped Benjamin's arm. You have to leave. What about you? A sad smile touched her face. I stayed too long. The hallway behind them darkened. Benjamin suddenly realized something horrifying. He could no longer remember the driver who had brought him to Willow End. The man's face was gone. Then the station. Then parts of the journey. His memories were disappearing. The house was remembering him. Rose saw the realization in his eyes. Run. The floor shook violently. Portraits fell from the walls. The fog surged upward. Benjamin turned and fled. The corridor stretched impossibly ahead. Doors appeared where none had existed before. Voices called his name. Familiar voices. His mother's voice. Old friends. Children from his classroom. Every door offered something he had lost. Every voice begged him to stop. He ran faster. At the end of the corridor stood a narrow servant's door. Rose pointed toward it. Go! Benjamin hesitated. Come with me! For the first time, tears filled her eyes. I can't. The darkness behind her deepened. The house was reclaiming her. Benjamin reached for her hand. Their fingers touched, cold as ice. For one impossible second, he thought he might pull her free. Then the house screamed. The sound erupted through every wall simultaneously. Rose gasped. The darkness seized her. Not visibly, not physically, simply pulling her backward into the shadows. Remember me, she whispered. Then she was gone. The door burst open. Benjamin stumbled into the night. Cold air struck his face. He ran across the field without looking back. The fog chased him. The piano music rose behind him. Faster now. Desperate. Broken. Halfway across the field he turned. Carrington Hall stood blazing with light. every window illuminated, every room alive. Figures moved behind the glass. The entire house seemed caught between existence and disappearance. Then slowly, impossibly, it began to dissolve. The roof vanished first, then the chimneys, then the upper floors. The fog swallowed everything, window by window, wall by wall, until only one remained, an upstairs window. Rose stood there, watching him. She raised one hand. Then the final window faded. The house disappeared. Morning found Benjamin beside the gate. The field was empty. No manor, no ruins, no foundations, nothing. Only grass. And lying near his feet was a small wooden soldier. Daniel Carrington's toy. Benjamin picked it up. The wood felt cold, real. The only proof that Carrington Hall had ever returned. Years later, long after he had left Willow End, Benjamin would keep the soldier on his desk. Visitors often asked where it came from. He never answered. Some stories are too strange for ordinary conversation. But every October, when fog gathered beyond his window, Benjamin would find himself listening, waiting. And sometimes, very late at night, just before midnight, he would hear a faint piano melody drifting through the darkness. The same melody Rose Carrington had played. The melody of a house that had been demolished, a family that had vanished, and a place waiting patiently beyond time for the next fog to bring it home again. The Curse of the Highland Witch. Rain had swallowed the highlands before Jonathan Brooks ever saw the village of Dunbury. It fell in grey slanting sheets across the windows of the coach, blurring the road until it seemed less a road than a dark stream winding between the mountains. Low clouds pressed upon the hills, hiding their peaks and filling the valley with a moving, colorless mist. The last daylight had already begun to fail, although evening was still some hours away. The coach descended slowly through a landscape of wet heather, black rock, and swollen burns. There were no farms, no travelers and lights upon the hill. Only the rain, the rattle of wheels, and the occasional groan of the carriage as it leaned into the wind. Then Jonathan saw the forest. It stood to the north of the road, dense and ancient, stretching across the hillside like a stain. The driver noticed Jonathan watching it. "You'll find no proper path in there," he said. Jonathan wiped condensation from the glass. "I had not yet decided to enter." The driver tightened his hands upon the reins. "Best see that you do not." Jonathan smiled, expecting the man to do the same. He did not. A flash of lightning opened the sky above the distant hills. For an instant, the forest seemed to stretch much farther than Jonathan had imagined, its trees climbing over ridge after ridge until they vanished beneath the clouds. Then darkness closed over it again. Dunbury appeared near dusk, huddled between the forest and a narrow inlet of the sea. Its stone cottages crouched beneath slate roofs shining with rain. Smoke clung low above the chimneys, unable to rise through the wet air. Beyond the village, the land fell sharply towards a black and restless shore. The coach stopped before an old inn. A wooden sign swung above the doorway, creaking upon its chains. Painted across it was a lone piper standing on a cliff beneath a white moon. The Piper's Rest. A woman came outside as Jonathan climbed down. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair pulled away from a stern but intelligent face. "You'll be Jonathan Brooks," she said. "I am. Margaret O'Reilly." She took his case and carried it beneath the doorway. "You have a room prepared?" "Only for tonight. Gregory Collum owns the bothy you rented. It stands beyond the village, near the shore." Jonathan looked towards the sea. The wind carried the sound of waves striking rock, a slow, heavy booming beneath the rain. "Is it far?" "Half a mile. Longer in weather such as this." Inside, the inn was warm with peat smoke and lamplight. Several men sat at the rough wooden tables, speaking over their drinks. Their voices weakened as Jonathan entered. He removed his wet coat and took a place near the fire. Margaret brought him ale and told him supper would follow. Jonathan had traveled through enough small villages to recognize the curiosity of isolated people. A stranger arrived, conversation paused, and every face turned briefly towards him. By morning, half the village would know where he had come from and why. He paid it no attention until a name reached him from the nearest table. Morak. An elderly fisherman leaned towards two younger men. "She was seen beyond the burn," he murmured. "He had been frightened," one man replied. "A boy does not lose his voice from fright." The third man glanced towards Jonathan and made a warning gesture. The fisherman fell silent. Jonathan stood. "Forgive me, who is Morak?" No one answered. Margaret stood behind the bar, a glass motionless in her hands. Jonathan smiled. "A local woman?" "Not a woman." "That is enough, Angus," Margaret said. Jonathan turned. "Now you've made me curious. That is rarely a blessing." She set down the glass and approached the fire. "Morak is a name from an old tale," she said. "Older than this village." "And what does the tale say?" "That she dwells in the forest." Jonathan glanced towards the rain-drowned window. "What is she supposed to be?" "A witch." One of the younger men crossed himself. Jonathan concealed his amusement. "I see." "No," Margaret replied. "You do not." The fire shifted in the grate. Sparks lifted into the chimney. Angus stared down into his ale. "Those who meet Morak die before the next full moon." Jonathan studied the men around the table. None seemed to be joking. "You believe this?" "My grandfather saw her when he was 19, Angus said. "He returned before dawn and never spoke of what happened. 12 days later, they found him dead in the peat shed. No injury, no sickness, only a black mark around his wrist. And this occurred how many years ago? 67. A story repeated for 67 years is not evidence. Margaret's eyes narrowed. A story repeated for centuries is not necessarily a lie. Supper arrived, and the conversation ended. Yet Jonathan continued to glance at the window. Rain ran over the glass in silver lines. Beyond it, the wind moved inland from the sea and passed through the village towards the forest. Something sighed in the chimney. For a moment, it resembled a woman breathing. Gregory Cullum arrived shortly after 9. He was lean, gray-bearded, and solemn, wearing a salt-stained coat. He greeted Jonathan politely, but spoke little as they left the Piper's Rest and walked towards the shore. The rain had weakened, though the wind remained strong. Gregory carried a lantern and guided Jonathan along a narrow road beyond the final cottages. The bothy stood alone above the sea. It was a squat stone building with a slate roof and 2 chimneys. Before it lay a cliff and the black water below. Behind it, perhaps 200 yards away, the ancient forest climbed over the ridge. The waves were louder there. They struck the rocks with deep, hollow blows. Between each impact came the withdrawal of water over stone, a dragging whispering like something breathing through broken teeth. Gregory unlocked the bothy. Inside were a main room, a narrow kitchen, and a small sleeping chamber. A peat fire glowed in the grate. The walls were thick and rough, the stones dark with age. "It appears comfortable enough," Jonathan said. "In fair weather." "And in weather like this?" "You will hear the sea, the chimney and the stones settling. Do not let them trouble you." Jonathan smiled. "You make it sound as though they might." Gregory showed him the provisions, the water pump, and the iron bolt upon the door. As he prepared to leave, Jonathan said, "I heard the story of Morak." Gregory's hand tightened around the lantern. "Margaret should not have filled your head with it. The fisherman did. Angus lived too long among old memories." "So you do not believe him?" Gregory looked towards the window, where rain shivered against the glass. "I believe some places should be left alone." "That is not the same answer." "No." At the doorway, he paused. "The forest path begins behind the ridge. Do not follow it after sunset." "I had no intention of doing so." Gregory studied him for a moment. "And should you hear a woman calling your name among the trees, do not answer. It matters little whose voices she uses." Jonathan laughed softly. "So you do believe it?" Gregory opened the door. Wind and salt air entered the bothy. "I believe warnings exist because someone once failed to heed them." Then he disappeared into the rain. Jonathan slept badly. The sea never seemed to rest. Each wave struck the cliff below with a muffled boom that trembled through the floor. Wind prowled around the bothy and moaned in the chimney. Sometime after midnight, Jonathan woke to 3 faint knocks. He sat up. The sound came again, not from the door, From within the wall beside his bed, 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. Jonathan placed his hand against the stone. It was cold and perfectly solid. Perhaps a branch scraping the outer wall. He lay down again. The tapping stopped. In the morning, the forest stood beneath a low ceiling of cloud. Its upper branches shifted in the wind, while the darkness below remained still. Jonathan returned to the Piper's Rest that afternoon. Margaret set a pint before him without being asked. The inn was busier than before. Fishermen and shepherds gathered around the fire, discussing broken nets, missing sheep, and a landslip upon the northern road. Eventually, as though drawn there by habit, the conversation returned to Morak. A railway porter named Malcolm spoke of a woman found wandering near the forest 20 years earlier. She had been barefoot despite the frozen ground and kept insisting that someone followed her. "She died before the full moon," he said. "From what?" Jonathan asked. "She stopped breathing." "People do. Not with black water running from their mouth." Silence spread across the inn. Jonathan lifted his glass. Every unexplained death in Dombre appears to have been given to this witch. A man dies in a shed, a woman falls ill, a boy becomes frightened, and Morak receives the blame. "What would you blame?" Angus asked. "Fear, disease, loneliness, drink?" Margaret placed another block of peat on the fire. "You seem determined to be disappointed by our legends." "On the contrary, they are fascinating." "Then you better admire them from a distance." Jonathan returned the following evening, and the evening after that. The Piper's Rest became part of his routine. He became a regular. He ate there, drank a few pints, and listened to the fishermen, crofters, and railwaymen exchange local gossip. But always the forest entered their conversation. There was a hunter who returned with blood upon his hands, but no wound upon his body. A shepherd who heard his dead mother call from among the pines. A family who heard voices inside their walls after the father across the forest burn. Jonathan challenged every account. He pointed out contradictions, demanded dates, and supplied ordinary explanations. The villagers certainly irritated him. They did not merely fear Morak. They accepted her as one accepts winter or the sea. The more they warned him, the more determined he became to prove them wrong. On his 5th evening at the inn, he announced that he intended to enter the forest. No one laughed. Margaret's expression hardened. "You have walked near it already?" "Along the edge." "That is far enough." "I intend to go farther tomorrow." Angus lowered his glass. "Do not." Jonathan smiled. "You cannot expect me to believe that a witch has lived among those trees for centuries." "She does not live as you understand living," Angus said. "And then I am unlikely to meet her." One of the shepherds rose and left without finishing his ale. The sudden silence unsettled Jonathan more than any argument. Margaret leaned towards him. "You arrived as a guest. Do not make yourself into another warning." Gregory visited the bothy that night. "Margaret told you," Jonathan said. "She did." "I'm taking a walk, nothing more." "Leave the forest alone." Jonathan folded his arms. You have repeated these stories so long that you no longer hear how absurd they sound. Gregory glanced towards the wall beside the sleeping chamber. Have the stones made any noises? Tapping. The building is old. How many times? Jonathan hesitated. 3. Gregory's face changed. Do not go there tomorrow. There is nothing there. I don't care what name you give the thing that waits in those woods. Gregory stepped closer. If a woman calls your name, do not answer. She may sound young or old. She may sound like someone you loved. Do not answer. Something scratched faintly within the far wall. Both men heard it. Gregory looked towards the sound. Leave in the morning, he said. Jonathan entered the forest the following evening. He waited until late afternoon. He took a lantern and followed the narrow path behind the ridge. The trees closed around him almost immediately. At first, the forest appeared ordinary. Rainwater clung to moss and fell from the branches. The earth smelled of pine, rot, and wet bark. The noise of the sea faded behind him. After half an hour, the path narrowed beneath ancient trunks and roots that twisted through the ground like black veins. The wind moved high above the canopy, but below, the air remained unnaturally still. Then the birds fell silent. Jonathan stopped. No wing stirred. No creature moved among the leaves. Even the distant surf had vanished. The forest seemed to be listening. He continued. Soon he found a standing stone half buried beneath moss. Symbols had been carved across its surface. Some were worn smooth with age. Others appeared freshly cut. Jonathan touched one. The groove was wet. Something moved behind him. He turned. Nothing stood between the trunks. Farther on, his compass needle began to tremble. It turned slowly, then pointed in a direction he knew could not be north. A sound came from ahead. Breathing. Jonathan raised the lantern. The flame bent sideways, though the air was still. Who is there? The breathing ceased. A branch cracked behind him. The path by which he had come was gone. Dense trunks and thorn now stood in its place. Mist gathered between the trees. Then a woman whispered his name. Jonathan. He froze. Gregory's warning returned to him. Do not answer. The voice came again, closer. Jonathan. He gripped the lantern. Jonathan. He turned. No one was there. Who is it? He called. The forest inhaled. Whispers rose on every side. They came from the branches, beneath the roots, and within the hollow trunks. Ahead, a pale figure stood between two trees. Jonathan did not see her arrive. She was simply there, tall and motionless, dressed in black garments ragged at the hem. Long hair concealed much of her face. Jonathan tried to step back. His body refused. The name entered Jonathan's mind. Morak. She approached. She raised one hand. Her blackened fingers closed around Jonathan's wrist. cold entered his blood. The forest vanished. Jonathan woke at dawn near the forest edge, soaked with dew and mud. His lantern was missing. For several minutes he remembered nothing. Then fragments returned. A pale face, voices beneath the earth, fingers closing over his skin. A black mark encircled his wrist. He rubbed it hard. It did not fade. Gregory found him walking unsteadily towards the bothy. "You went," he said. "I became lost." Gregory saw the mark. "What did you see?" "Nothing." "Do not lie." "I was tired. I fell and struck my head." "Did she call your name?" Jonathan looked away. "Did you answer?" "I dreamed it." Gregory released him. "Dreams do not have marks." That evening, Jonathan returned to the Piper's Rest. The villagers stared as he entered. "Well," he said, taking his usual seat, "I entered your forest." No one replied. "And I found no witch." Margaret's gaze fell upon his wrist. "What did you find?" "Mud, trees, poor sense of direction." "Nothing else?" "Nothing." She placed a tankard before him. "Then why do you look as though something followed you out?" That night, the tapping returned. 3 knocks sounded from within the wall beside Jonathan's bed. Then 3 more. He lit the lamp. The sound stopped. Jonathan pressed his ear against the stone. At first he heard only the distant sea. Then something whispered from inside the wall. "Jonathan." He spent the rest of the night beside the fire. In the morning, the chair beside the hearth had been turned towards the sleeping chamber. The front door was unlocked. Jonathan told himself he had walked in his sleep. The following night, the fire died without warning. One moment, the peat glowed red. The next, the room was dark. Jonathan relit the lamp. A scraping moved slowly across the western wall, beginning near the floor and traveling upward, as though fingernails dragged over the stone from within. Jonathan struck the wall with the iron poker. The scraping stopped. Something struck back. Once, twice, 3 times. Dust fell from the ceiling. A low, wet laugh sounded behind the stones. By daylight, the bothy no longer felt empty. Objects shifted whenever Jonathan turned away. A spoon fell from the center of the table. The cattle lid lifted and clattered to the floor. The small mirror above the washstand clouded, as though someone had breathed upon it. Then slowly, letters appeared. S-T-I-L-L-H-E-R-E. Still here. Jonathan wiped it away. It returned. At the Piper's Rest, he drank more than usual. "You should not remain alone tonight," Margaret said. "I am perfectly well." "You have not slept." "The sea is loud." "The sea was loud before you entered the forest." Jonathan looked down at his drink. "What do you hear in the bothy?" she asked. "Nothing. Gregory told me about the tapping. He imagines danger everywhere. Margaret leaned closer. If the voices begin, do not answer them. That night, a storm rose from the sea. Rain hammered the roof. Wind screamed around the bothy. Waves struck the cliffs with such force that the floor trembled beneath Jonathan's feet. Shortly before midnight, footsteps approached from the direction of the forest. Slow, dragging. They circled the bothy and stopped outside the door. 3 knocks. Jonathan did not move. 3 more. Then Gregory's voice called from outside.
Jonathan, open the door.
Jonathan approached. Gregory?
Let me in.
His hand moved toward the bolt. Then he remembered the forest. Why are you here? No answer. Gregory?
Open the door.
The voice was nearly perfect. Beneath it, however, another voice spoke at the same time, deeper and guttural, shaping the words too slowly. Jonathan backed away. The knocking grew louder. Gregory's voice became Margaret's, then Angus's, then Jonathan's dead sister. Jonathan covered his ears. The knocking ceased. All 4 walls began to whisper. Hundreds of voices moved through the stone. Some prayed. Some sobbed or laughed. Others repeated Jonathan's name in accents from different countries and centuries. The fire turned blue. The lamp flame shrank. A child's voice spoke beside Jonathan's ear.
She is coming through.
The stones beside the chimney bulged inward. Mortar cracked. Dust spilled onto the floor. The outline of a face pressed through the wall as if the rock had become soft flesh. Its mouth opened. A demonic voice shook the room.
I'm still here.
Jonathan hurled the poker. The face vanished. Every object in the bothy rose into the air. Chairs, cups, plates, and bottles hung motionless for a single terrible instant. Then everything crashed down. The lamp went out. From the sleeping chamber came the sound of someone breathing. Jonathan struck a match. Her face was inches from his own. The flame died. Jonathan fled. He did not remember removing the bolt. One moment he stood in darkness with Morak behind him. The next he was running barefoot through the storm. Rain blinded him. The sea roared below. Behind him, the bothy windows glowed red. Shapes moved within. Dozens of them. Jonathan reached the cliff and stopped. Far below, a woman stood in the surf. Morak looked up at him. Her black dress spread across the water like oil. The dead stood around her. The hunter, the drowned woman, a frozen child, and others without faces. Morak raised one hand and pointed towards the moon, struggling behind the clouds. Jonathan collapsed. Gregory found him at dawn near the bothy door. The storm had passed, but the sea remained violent. Gray waves rolled beneath the colorless sky. The forest dripped silently behind the ridge. Inside, the room lay in ruins. Furniture had been overturned. Broken dishes covered the floor. Black stains marked the walls. The stone beside the chimney was split from floor to ceiling. Jonathan opened his eyes. "I'm leaving," he whispered. Gregory nodded. "You should have left before." Jonathan returned to the Piper's Rest that afternoon to say goodbye. The inn became silent when he entered. He looked 20 years older than the man who had arrived. His skin was gray, his eyes hollow, and his hands so unsteady that he could barely fasten his coat. Margaret came around the bar. "Stay until morning." "No. The train leaves after dark." "I know." "Then take tomorrow's." Jonathan glanced at the windows. Mist had already begun to gather over the village. "I have stayed too long." Gregory stood near the fire. "You cannot outrun what has marked you." Jonathan forced a thin smile. "You still believe I saw her?" "You do too." The smile vanished. Jonathan looked around the inn. No one mocked him. No one appeared pleased to have been proven right. "I came to tell you that nothing happened," he said. "There was wind in the walls, rats, exhaustion." "No one here requires you to lie," Margaret said. A faint whisper came from the chimney.
Jonathan.
His eyes moved towards it. No one else reacted. He took his glass. "Goodbye, Mrs. O'Reilly." "Jonathan," he stopped. "Do not board that train." He opened the door. Cold mist entered the inn. "I'm going home." The station lay several miles from Dunbury, a small platform beside a single line. By the time Jonathan arrived, darkness covered the Highlands. The night train came shortly before 10. Steam rolled across the platform. Dim lamps glowed behind Rain Street windows. Jonathan boarded a carriage near the rear. For the first time in days, he felt safe. The upholstered seats, steady lamps, and rhythmic wheels belonged to the rational world. Dunbury and its forest began to fall behind. Jonathan closed his eyes. When he opened them, an old man sat opposite him. The seat had been empty before. The man wore an old-fashioned hunting coat. Mud covered his boots. His face was rigid and pale. Beside him sat a woman with seawater dripping from her dress. Farther down the carriage, a child stared through the window, frost glittering in his hair. Other passengers occupied the adjoining compartment. None spoke. None breathed. Their clothing came from different ages. Some were wet, burned, or covered in earth. Others bore ropes or dark marks around their throats. Slowly, the hunter turned his head. His eyes were black. The drowned woman looked towards Jonathan. The child turned from the window. One by one, every passenger faced him. Jonathan stood. The lamps flickered. Outside, the countryside vanished. The ancient forest rushed past the windows. Branches scraped against the carriage as if the train were passing through the heart of the woods. Jonathan pulled at the door. It would not open. The lamps went out one by one, beginning at the far end. With each dying light, a passenger rose. The dead filled the aisle. Morak stood at the end of the carriage. Her hair moved in an unseen wind. Beneath the pale skin of her face, other faces shifted and opened their mouths. Jonathan remembered everything. Her voice in the forest, her fingers upon his wrist, the endless procession of souls among the trees. He remembered seeing himself standing with them. Morak walked towards him. The dead parted. Jonathan struck the locked door. "Help me!" The spirits repeated his plea.
Help me.
Morak stopped before him. The mark around his wrist began to burn. She placed her hand over it. For one instant, Jonathan saw the bothy, the black shore, and the forest beneath the moon. He saw every soul Morak had claimed walking endlessly among the trees. Then he saw his own body sitting upright in the railway carriage, its face frozen in terror. His heart stopped. The next thing he remembered was stepping from a train at the station in his hometown. Morning had come. Porters moved luggage through clouds of steam. Families greeted one another beneath the iron roof. Jonathan felt strangely light. The mark no longer hurt. He looked back. The Highland carriage was gone. He left the station and entered the familiar streets. Shopkeepers raised shutters. Carriages rolled over wet cobbles. Church bells sounded nearby. Dunbray seemed impossibly distant. Jonathan saw Mr. Wilkes, an acquaintance from his club, approaching. "Wilkes!" The man continued walking. Jonathan raised a hand. "Good morning." Wilkes passed without looking at him. A woman carrying a basket walked directly towards Jonathan. He stepped aside, but she did not alter her course. She passed through him. Cold spread through his body. The woman shivered and glanced over her shoulder before moving on. Jonathan entered a shop. The bell above the door did not ring. The assistant stood behind the counter. "I require a cab," Jonathan said. The man did not look up. Jonathan struck the counter. There was no sound. His fingers appeared pale and almost transparent. A mirror hung upon the opposite wall. The shop, the counter, and the assistant were reflected clearly. Jonathan was not. He stumbled back into the street. People flowed around him without seeing him. He called to them, he shouted, but no one turned. Across the road, a newspaper boy held up the morning edition. Jonathan saw his own face beneath the headline. "Local traveler found dead on Highland train." He crossed the street. The article reported that Jonathan Brooks had been discovered dead inside a railway carriage after leaving a remote village in the Scottish Highlands. There were no wounds. No cause of death had been established. His body had been removed at the station more than 100 miles from his hometown. The expression upon his face suggested extreme terror. Jonathan read the article again. Then he looked at his hands. Behind him, a woman whispered his name.
Jonathan.
He closed his eyes. The voice came again. The noise of the town began to fade. Footsteps, carriage wheels, and human voices dissolved into wind moving through trees. Jonathan turned. Morak stood at the far end of the street. The dead passengers gathered behind her. The hunter, the drowned woman, the frozen child. The buildings disappeared into mist. Cobblestones became wet earth. The walls of the town rose into ancient trunks. The smell of salt returned. Somewhere beyond the trees, waves struck a black shore. Morak turned and entered the forest. The spirits followed. Jonathan tried to remain where he stood. The mark returned around his wrist. Invisible hands closed upon him. He joined the procession. Days later, Gregory Cullum entered the bothy beside the sea. Black stains remained upon the walls. The cracked stones beside the chimney had not moved. The chair stood facing the bed. From within the wall came 3 faint knocks. Gregory closed the door and never entered the bothy again. At the Piper's Rest, Margaret O'Reilly continued serving fishermen, shepherds, and the occasional traveler who found his way to Dunbury. Sometimes strangers asked about the ancient forest. Some laughed when they heard the name Morak. Others declared that witches belonged to old stories and frightened minds. When that happened, the villagers fell silent. Margaret looked towards the black trees beyond the windows, and she told them about Jonathan Brooks, the skeptic who entered the forest, answered a woman calling his name, and boarded the night train home. She told them how he returned to his hometown without knowing that he was dead. And whenever the wind moved down from the forest and whispered through the chimney of the Piper's Rest, no one in Dunbury answered, for they knew that Morak was still listening, and that the next full moon was never far away. The Woman in the Marsh. The train slowed as it crossed the edge of Dead Man's Fen. Thomas Langley sat alone in the nearly empty carriage, watching the darkness drift past the rain-speckled window. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels had become slower now, more deliberate, as though even the locomotive were reluctant to continue. Beyond the glass stretched mile after mile of marshland. Silver reeds swayed beneath a pale autumn moon. Pools of black water reflected fragments of cold light. Here and there, clusters of twisted trees emerged from the mist like ancient sentinels standing watch over the fen. The engine gave a long, mournful whistle. Steam rolled past the windows in ghostly white clouds. For a moment, the moon disappeared behind it. Then the train rounded a gentle curve. Ahead, Thomas caught sight of the station. A narrow wooden platform, a solitary lamp burning beside a weather-beaten sign. Beyond it stood a dark wall of woodland pressing close to the tracks, while a low fog drifted silently between the trees. The locomotive released a deep sigh of steam as it came to a halt. The sound echoed across the marsh and seemed to vanish into the mist. Thomas gathered his case and rose from his seat. He did not know it then, but before another sunrise, he would hear that same whistle in his dreams for the rest of his life. The station at Wicklow was little more than a waiting room, a ticket office, and a platform of damp timber darkened by years of rain. No crowd waited there. No porters hurried forward. No cheerful lamps shone from nearby houses. The train had left him in a place that seemed already half forgotten. A man in a railway coat stepped from the ticket office and watched Thomas descend. "You'll be the schoolmaster," he said. Thomas smiled faintly. I suppose news travels quickly here. Faster than trains, most days. The man took his ticket, glanced once toward the Marsh, and then back at Thomas. You have rooms arranged in the village? At the Black Lantern Inn for tonight. I am to take up my post at the school on Monday. The man nodded. Road straight enough. Keep the station behind you and follow the lane until you see the church tower. Thomas thanked him and lifted his case. He had taken only a few steps when the railway man called after him. Best not wander beyond the road after dark. Thomas turned. The man had already begun retreating into the office, but his face remained visible in the glow of the lamp. The fan is not forgiving, he said. Then he closed the door. Thomas stood for a moment beneath the platform lamp, listening as the train grew fainter in the distance. Its final whistle came from somewhere beyond the trees, thin, sorrowful. Then even that was gone. He set off toward Wicklow. The village appeared gradually, not all at once. First the square tower of the church, its outline dark against the moon. Then a few roofs. Then narrow cottages with shuttered windows and walls slick with damp. The road dipped past the blacksmith's yard and rose toward a small green where an old inn stood, with firelight glowing in its lower windows. Inside, the air smelled of peat smoke, ale, and rain-soaked wool. A fire burned low in the hearth. Several men sat close to it, speaking in the quiet tones of people accustomed to long evenings and unwelcome weather. Conversation faded when Thomas entered. It resumed only after the innkeeper had shown him to a table and brought him supper. Thomas had lived long enough in small English towns to understand that strangers were rarely invisible. He did not mind being observed. He was 35 years of age, neatly dressed, mild in manner, and given more to books than argument. His appointment as schoolmaster had brought him to Wicklow after several lean years of temporary positions, and he intended to make a respectable beginning. The food was plain but good. He had just begun to feel some warmth return to his hands when he noticed the old man. He sat alone near the side of the hearth, his body bent slightly forward, both hands resting upon the head of a walking stick. He had a narrow face, deeply lined, with gray hair combed back from a high forehead. His clothes were old but well kept, and his eyes, though tired, were sharp. After a while, the old man rose and crossed the room. "You are Mr. Langley." Thomas looked up. "I am. Walter Crane." The old man lowered himself into the opposite chair without waiting to be invited, though his manner was not rude. It was simply the manner of an old man who had spent too many years in one place to ask permission of furniture. "I heard you're here to teach the children." "That is the plan, yes." Walter studied him for a few seconds. "You've come from London?" "No, not directly. I spent the last year near Cambridge." "A learned man, then?" Thomas smiled. "Learned enough to know how much I do not know." The old man gave no answering smile. His gaze drifted toward the window, where fog had begun pressing against the glass in pale, shapeless folds. "You'll learn something here," Walter said. Something in his tone made Thomas pause. Several of the men near the fire had fallen quiet again. Walter leaned a little closer. You know the name of the fen? Dead Man's Fen. And you know why it's called that? I assume there are several explanations, each more dramatic than the last. One of the men by the fire shifted uneasily. Walter's face remained still. There are names beneath that water, Mr. Langley. Men, women, children. Travelers who thought they knew the path. Farmers who went out for lost sheep. Boys who dared one another to cross by moonlight. Some were found. Most were not. Thomas nodded respectfully. Marshland is dangerous, I have no doubt of it. That is not what I mean. The fire cracked. A gust of wind pressed against the end door. Walter lowered his voice. There is a woman in the marsh. The words were spoken so plainly that Thomas did not at first know how to receive them. A living woman? No. The silence around the hearth deepened. Walter's eyes had not left Thomas. She's seen in the fog, most often under a full moon, though not always. A white figure standing among the reeds, sometimes near the old causeway, sometimes beyond the drowned willows. She does not call. She does not wave. She simply stands there until she knows she has been seen. Thomas set down his knife. And then? Then she walks away. That sounds hardly threatening. No, Walter said. That is why men follow. The old man's words settled heavily in the room. Thomas, feeling the attention of the others, gave a small polite smile. And who is she supposed to be? Lenora Fenwick. At that name, a woman near the serving hatch crossed herself. Walter continued. She lived here long before your time, before mine. Some say she was promised to a man who never came. Some say she was betrayed by her own kin. Some say she walked out into the fen one night, carrying something in her arms and never returned. The parish book says only that she was missing. People vanish in marshes, Thomas said gently. They do. Walter's expression did not change. But they do not come back 50 years later, wearing the same white dress. Thomas said nothing. The old man leaned closer. If you see her, do not answer her. If she walks away, do not follow. And if you find yourself thinking she means no harm, turn back twice as quickly. Thomas watched the fire for a moment. Mr. Crane, I thank you for the warning, truly. But I'm not a man inclined to chase apparitions. Walter stood slowly. No one is, Mr. Langley, he said. Until they see her. Then he returned to his place by the hearth. Thomas slept poorly that night. His room overlooked the green, with the church tower visible beyond the rooftops. Several times he woke believing he had heard footsteps outside, though the street below was empty each time he looked. Near dawn he dreamed of the train whistle, long and mournful, sounding not from the railway, but from somewhere deep within the marsh. Morning made the village appear more ordinary. Wicklow was small, damp and poor, but not unpleasant. The school stood beside the churchyard, a simple brick building with narrow windows and a slate roof. Thomas spent much of the day with the parish clerk, receiving keys, ledgers, and a list of pupils whose names he would soon learn by heart. By afternoon, he had almost dismissed the previous evening's talk as rural theater. Almost. It was late when he left the schoolhouse. The parish clerk had insisted on showing him every cupboard, every ink bottle, every flaw in the roof, and every disagreement the village had ever had about firewood. By the time Thomas stepped into the lane, dusk had already begun to gather. A narrow footway ran along raised ground between the village and the marsh. It seemed safe enough in the fading light. On one side were fields, on the other, reeds and pools of black water stretched beneath low clouds. The moon, nearly full, rose pale behind a thinning veil of mist. Thomas walked slowly, listening. There were sounds there, but they were not the sounds of ordinary countryside. Water moved without visible cause. Reeds whispered though the wind had dropped. Somewhere far off, a bird cried once, and the cries seemed to travel too long across the fen before dying away. He turned back when he judged he had gone far enough. That was when the fog came in. It did not roll slowly from one direction as fog usually does. It seemed to rise from the ground itself, lifting from the pools and ditches in pale layers until the path behind him was half obscured. Thomas quickened his pace. The church tower should have been visible ahead. It was not. He stopped. For the first time since arriving in Wicklow, he understood how easy it would be to lose the road. The marsh had no clear shape in fog. Distance collapsed. Every reed bed resembled another. The pools reflected the moon in broken fragments, so that light seemed to lie everywhere and nowhere. Then he saw her. At first he thought she was a trick of mist, a vertical whiteness among the reeds. He blinked, and the figure remained. A woman stood perhaps 30 yards away, just beyond the edge of the raised path. She wore a long white dress that stirred slightly at the hem, though the air around Thomas was still. Her hair appeared dark against her pale shoulders. Her face was turned toward him, but the fog softened her features until he could not see her clearly. Thomas did not move. His first thought was not of ghosts, but of danger. A woman alone in the marsh at night might be lost, injured, distraught. "Madam?" he called. The figure did not answer. "Are you in need of help?" For several seconds she remained motionless. Then she turned and began to walk away. Not hurriedly, not fearfully. She moved with a slow, steady grace, passing between the reeds without disturbing them. Walter Crane's words returned at once. If she walks away, do not follow. Thomas stood rooted to the path. He told himself to turn back. He told himself there would be no shame in returning to the inn and reporting what he had seen. Then the woman paused and looked over her shoulder. Not fully, only enough. A pale face half seen through fog. There was something in that glance which struck him more deeply than fear. It was sorrow. Such sorrow that for a moment Thomas forgot the marsh, the warning, the cold, and the growing dark. Then she walked on. Thomas followed. He called to her twice more, but she gave no sign of hearing him. Each time he feared he had lost her. Her white form reappeared ahead, moving between pools and over strips of firmer ground he had not noticed before. The fog thickened. The village vanished. The path vanished. After several minutes, Thomas no longer knew whether he was walking east or west, toward Wicklow or away from it. Mud clung to his boots. Water soaked the hem of his trousers. The moon appeared and disappeared overhead in fragments as though seen through torn cloth. Then the woman was gone. Thomas stopped. Before him lay only reeds, fog, and black water. He turned slowly. Nothing. For the first time that night, true fear moved through him. "Madam?" His voice echoed through the marsh. There was no answer. He began walking in what he hoped was the direction of the village. Twice he nearly stepped into water. Once his boot sank so deeply into mud that he had to pull it free with both hands. The fog closed behind him as though erasing every step. Then he saw a light. Not a lantern, not a wandering flame. A ball of warm yellow brightness floating in the dark. Thomas stared. As he approached, more windows appeared around it. A roofline emerged, then chimneys, then a dark timber front and a sign swinging gently above the low doorway. The Black Lantern Inn. Relief overcame caution. An inn, hidden in the fen, perhaps, but real, solid, warm. Thomas climbed the 3 stone steps and pushed open the door. A wave of heat met him. The room beyond was larger than expected, with dark beams, polished tables, and a generous fire burning in the hearth. Candles stood in brass holders. Rain tapped softly against the windows, though Thomas had not noticed rain outside. The air smelled of roast meat, wood smoke, and old ale. Behind the counter stood a tall, narrow man in a black coat. He looked up the moment Thomas entered. "Good evening, sir," he said. "A difficult night to be abroad." Thomas removed his hat. His hands were trembling. "I lost my way in the fen." "So many do." The man's voice was calm and even. "My name is Redmayne. I keep the house." "Thomas Langley." "A pleasure, Mr. Langley. You will want supper and a room?" "If one is available." Mr. Redmayne smiled faintly. "There is always a room at the Black Lantern Inn." The phrase ought to have comforted him. It did not. Only 4 guests sat in the common room. An elderly woman in mourning black occupied a chair near the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her pale eyes rested on Thomas with solemn attention. Mr. Redmayne introduced her as Martha Henshaw. Beside the window sat a broad-faced gentleman with silver spectacles and a formal manner, Matthew Ashling. He inclined his head with grave courtesy. A third man, Charles Hargrove, had the appearance of a traveling merchant. Good coat, anxious hands, watchful eyes. He smiled too quickly and looked away too often. The last was a young woman, Emily Merrick. She sat slightly apart from the others, her chair angled toward the fire, but her gaze fixed upon Thomas. She could not have been more than 22. Her face was delicate, almost translucent in the candlelight, and there was something about her that made Thomas pause. Not because she resembled the woman in the marsh exactly, she did not, but there was a likeness in her eyes, the same stillness, the same sorrow. "You are very wet, Mr. Langley," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, but the words carried an odd weight. So I am. You should not have come by the fen. I did not intend to. No, said Matthew Ashling, folding his newspaper, though Thomas had not seen him reading it. Few do. Supper was brought without Thomas ordering it. That too seemed strange, though he was too hungry and cold to object. A place was set for him at the table. Mr. Redmayne poured wine. The guests resumed their conversation, but Thomas soon noticed that they spoke in a manner both polite and incomplete. They referred to people without explaining who they were. They mentioned local matter without dates. They laughed softly at things that did not seem amusing. No one asked him about the school. No one asked him why he came to Wicklow. No one spoke of mourning. When Thomas mentioned that he had arrived by train that very evening, Charles Hargrove looked sharply at him. By train? Yes. To Wicklow. To the station. Mr. Hargrove's fingers tightened around his glass. I did not know it still stopped there. Thomas smiled politely. Well, it stopped there tonight. Martha Henshaw closed her eyes. Matthew Ashling cleared his throat. Travel changes quickly, he said. Indeed, Thomas replied, though I suppose not so quickly here. No one answered. The fire hissed. Outside, something brushed softly against the window. Thomas turned, but saw only fog pressed close to the glass. A little later, Emily Merrick spoke. What year is it now? The question was asked so quietly that Thomas thought at first he had misheard. I beg your pardon? She looked down at her hands. The year. Mr. Redmayne, who stood near the sideboard, became perfectly still. Thomas glanced from one face to another. 1894. The change in the room was immediate. Martha Henshaw made a small sound in her throat. Charles Hargrove looked toward the door as if considering flight. Matthew Ashling's expression tightened into something like pain. Emily Merrick whispered, So long. Thomas set down his fork. What do you mean? Mr. Redmayne moved then. Miss Merrick is prone to melancholy on storm nights, he said smoothly. The marsh has that effect on sensitive temperaments. Emily looked at Thomas as if she wished to speak. Then she lowered her gaze. After supper, Mr. Redmayne showed Thomas upstairs. The corridor was narrow, lined with dark wallpaper patterned in faded reeds and birds. The floorboards creaked beneath their steps. Several doors stood close on either side. At the end of the passage, Thomas saw a white figure, only for an instant. A woman standing in the gloom near the stairwell. Then Mr. Redmayne lifted his candle and the passage was empty. Something wrong, sir? Thomas stared. No, nothing. His room was small but comfortable. Mr. Redmayne placed the candle on the table and gave him a key. Sleep well, Mr. Langley. I should like to leave early. Of course. Is there a safe path back to Wicklow? Mr. Redmayne's smile did not move beyond his mouth. In daylight, all paths seem safe. Then he left. Thomas locked the door. For a long while he did not sleep. The inn was too quiet. No laughter rose from downstairs. No footsteps moved along the corridor. Even the rain had ceased, though mist still pressed against the window in pale folds. At some hour past midnight, he woke suddenly. He did not remember falling asleep. The candle had burned low. The room was cold. Then came a sound from above him. A low step. Pause. Another step. Thomas sat up. There should have been no floor above his room. From outside, he had seen the roof sloping directly overhead. The footsteps crossed from one side of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. A whisper came from the corridor. Not a word, only the suggestion of one. Thomas rose, took the candle, and opened the door. The corridor was empty. All the lamps had gone out except one at the far end. Its light flickered weakly against the wallpaper. Then he saw her again. The woman in white stood at the head of the stairs. This time her face was clearer. Pale, young, beautiful in a ruined, sorrowful way. Thomas could not breathe. "Lenora?" he whispered, though he did not know why. The woman turned her head. For a moment he thought she might answer. Instead, she stepped backward into shadow and disappeared. Thomas followed to the stairs. Below, the common room lay dark. The fire had sunk to ember. A clock stood beside the mantel, its hands fixed at 11:47. Thomas descended. Near the back of the room stood a door he had not noticed before. It was slightly ajar. A thin line of candlelight showed within. He crossed to it and listened. Silence. He pushed it open. The room beyond was an office. Shelves lined the walls. Ledgers and papers lay stacked upon a desk. A strong smell of dust and damp hung in the air, though the rest of the inn had seemed carefully kept. Thomas knew he should leave. Instead, he stepped inside. On the desk lay a guest register. He opened it. The most recent page contained his own name, Thomas Langley. The ink was still dark. Above it were other names. Martha Henshaw, Matthew Ashling, Charles Hargrove, and Emily Merrick. He turned back a page. The same names appeared, and again, and again, page after page. The dates changed. 1871 to 1875. But the names remained. His skin prickled. At the bottom of one page, he found another name written in a different hand. Lenora Fenwick. The ink had faded to a reddish brown. He turned the page with shaking fingers. A folded newspaper clipping slipped loose and fell to the floor. Thomas picked it up. The paper was brittle and yellowed. The headline read, "Fire at the Black Lantern Inn." He read by candlelight. The article told of a storm in October of 1859. The Black Lantern Inn, then standing on the edge of Deadman's Fen, had caught fire shortly before midnight. By the time villagers reached it, the building was consumed. No one survived. Among the dead were the innkeeper, several travelers, an elderly widow named Martha Henshaw, Matthew Ashling, Merchant Charles Hargrove, and a young woman named Emily Merrick. Thomas read the names twice, then a third time. His breath sounded harsh in the little room. There was more. Missing woman believed lost in Fen. Lenora Fenwick, aged 24, disappeared from Wicklow on the night of a full moon in October of 1854. She was last seen walking toward Deadman's Fen after leaving service at a local household. Search parties found no trace of her. Pinned beneath the clipping was a photograph. It was faded almost beyond recognition, but the face remained. The woman in white. Lenora Fenwick. Thomas lowered the paper. He turned. Emily Merrick stood in the doorway. She wore the same dress she had worn at supper, though now it seemed older somehow, its fabric dulled by time. Thomas could not speak. Emily entered and closed the door behind her. "You read it," she said. "The inn burned." "Yes." "You died." Her face tightened, not in anger, but in weariness. "Yes." "And the others?" "All of us." Thomas gripped the edge of the desk. "This is impossible." Emily gave a sad smile. "That is what everyone says at first." He looked toward the register. "Why are your names written again and again?" "Because the night repeats. Not always, not every year. Only when she walks." "Lenora." Emily's eyes darkened. "And what does she want?" Emily looked down. "To go home." The answer was so simple and so terrible that Thomas felt the room shrink around him. "She cannot find the road," Emily continued. "So she follows the living. Or perhaps she asks them to follow her. I don't know anymore. Those who follow her come here. To the inn. To what is left of it. But why?" Emily's voice trembled. "Because we are lost too." Outside the office, a floorboard creaked. Emily looked toward the door. "You must leave before dawn." "I thought dawn would free me." "No, dawn takes the inn away. If you are still inside when it goes, you go with it." Thomas stared at her. "And the others?" "They no longer try." "Why help me?" For the first time, tears shone in her eyes. "Because I followed her once too." A knock sounded at the door. Slow. Measured. Emily stepped back. Mr. Redmayne's voice came softly from the other side. Emily whispered, "Go." Thomas crossed to the window. It was small but old. He forced the latch. Cold air rushed in, heavy with fog. Behind him, the door handle began to turn. Emily seized his arm. "Do not follow her voice," she whispered. "Follow the train." "What?" But there was no time. The door opened. Mr. Redmayne stood in the doorway, candle in hand, his polite face utterly calm. "Leaving us so soon?" Thomas climbed through the window and dropped into the mud outside. The cold struck him like water. He ran. Behind him, the Black Lantern Inn glowed warmly through the fog. Its windows were bright. Its door stood open. For one dreadful moment, he saw all the guests standing inside watching him. Martha Henshaw, Matthew Ashling, Charles Hargrove, Mr. Redmayne, Emily Merrick. Then the fog swallowed them. Thomas stumbled through Dead Man's Fen with no path beneath his feet. Reeds lashed at his coat, mud dragged at his boots. Water shone black on every side. The moon had vanished behind cloud, and the world had become a gray labyrinth without direction. Then he heard her. Not behind him. Ahead. Thomas. He stopped. The voice was soft. A woman's voice. He turned and saw Lenora Fenwick standing among the reeds. She was closer than before. Her white dress was stained at the hem with dark water. Her hair hung loose now around her face. Thomas, she whispered. He took one step toward her, then another. The sorrow in her face was unbearable. She looked not monstrous, but abandoned. A woman who had waited too long in the cold. A woman who had forgotten everything except the need to be found. From somewhere far away came a sound. A train whistle. Thin. Mournful. Thomas froze. Follow the train. The whistle came again, fainter this time. He turned from Lenora and ran toward it. At once the marsh changed. The ground dipped. Water closed around his ankles. Something beneath the surface brushed against his leg. Behind him, Lenora cried out, not in rage, but grief. The sound nearly broke him. He ran harder. The train whistle sounded a third time, now to his left. He turned. The fog shifted. For an instant he saw iron rails gleaming in moonlight beyond the reeds. Then they were gone. He pushed forward, tearing his hands on thorns, losing one shoe in the mud, gasping as cold air burned his lungs. Behind him came another voice. Mr. Langley, stay until morning. You are safe here. Do not leave us. Emily's voice came last. Do not stop. The ground rose suddenly beneath him. Gravel crunched under his remaining shoe. He fell forward onto hard earth. For several seconds he could only lie there, breathing. When he lifted his head, he saw the railway line. The station lamp burned in the distance. The first gray light of dawn had begun to touch the sky. Behind him, Dead Man's Fen lay silent. No inn, no voices, no woman in white. Mist and black water. Thomas reached Wicklow half an hour later. Walter Crane was waiting outside the Wicklow Arms. He did not ask where Thomas had been. He looked at the mud on Thomas's clothes, the blood on his hands, the missing shoe, and then turned his eyes toward the fen. You saw her. Thomas tried to answer, but no words came. Walter nodded once. She let you go? No, Thomas said hoarsely. The old man looked at him. Thomas turned toward the station, where a faint trail of steam still hung above the trees in the morning air. Someone else did. Thomas remained in Wicklow for 7 years. He taught the children. He repaired the schoolroom roof at his own expense. He planted a row of chestnut trees near the churchyard. By all accounts, he was a good schoolmaster, though a quiet one. He never married. He never crossed Dead Man's Fen after sunset. Years later, after he had left Wicklow and grown old in another country, Thomas would sometimes wake before dawn convinced he had heard a train whistle in the dark. On such mornings, he would rise, light a candle, and stand by the window until daylight came. But there was one night, late in his life, when the fog lay thick against the glass and the moon shone pale above the fields. Thomas woke to silence. No whistle, no wind, no sound at all. He went to the window. Far beyond the garden wall, where no marshland should have been, stood a woman in white. She was motionless beneath the moon, watching, waiting, still searching for the road home. The candle in room 13. The rain had begun shortly after sunset and showed no sign of stopping. Arthur Pembroke sat in the rear of the coach with his coat folded tightly around him and watched the countryside disappear behind sheets of gray water and drifting fog. What had begun that morning as a pleasant autumn journey through quiet provincial roads had gradually become slower and less inviting as the hours passed. Villages grew smaller, distances between houses widened. Even the road beneath the wheels seemed older and less traveled than before. Arthur did not mind. He had always preferred places that had escaped progress. Modern cities bored him. They had become too similar to one another. But old places still kept secrets. Old buildings remembered things. He traveled often and rarely hurried. His profession gave him the luxury of moving slowly and observing. Wherever he went, he filled notebooks with sketches, descriptions, and impressions of local history. One thing he never collected were ghost stories. Not because he disliked them, quite the opposite. He enjoyed them immensely, though only as inventions meant to entertain weary travelers beside warm fires. In Arthur's experience, every haunting eventually proved to be loneliness, grief, poor lighting, old timber shifting in cold weather, or exceptionally creative innkeepers seeking business during the winter months. Outside the coach window, the fog thickened. The driver, who had barely spoken during the last hour, leaned slightly backward and raised his voice above the rain. "We're nearly there, sir." Arthur looked ahead. For several moments, he saw nothing at all. Then the outline slowly emerged through the storm. At first, only shadow, then windows, then towers. The building revealed itself gradually from the rain, as though reluctant to be seen before night had fully settled upon the countryside. The Belgrave Grand Hotel stood alone on rising ground above the road. It had clearly once been magnificent. Built from dark stone in the high Victorian style, the hotel stretched wider than Arthur expected, its narrow windows glowing faintly beneath steep roofs and weathered towers. Several lamps burned warmly behind curtains, while much of the great structure remained dark, leaving the impression that large portions of the hotel had long since fallen out of use. Attached to one side stood an older tavern connected by a covered passageway. Candlelight flickered behind the tavern windows, golden and inviting against the storm. Arthur smiled faintly. Exactly the sort of place he enjoyed discovering. The carriage stopped. As Arthur stepped down into the rain and paid the driver, the man accepted the money, but did not immediately leave. Instead, he glanced toward the hotel with an expression Arthur could not quite read. "Only one thing, sir." Arthur looked up. "If they offer you room 13, the driver hesitated. "Take another." Arthur could not help smiling. "Do people still say such things?" The driver offered no answer. He merely tipped his hat, turned the carriage, and vanished slowly into the rain and fog. Arthur stood for a moment beneath the dark silhouette of the Belgrave Grand Hotel before finally stepping inside. The lobby was unexpectedly warm. The air carried the pleasant scent of polished wood, old books, extinguished candles, and something faintly floral that had settled permanently into the walls generations ago. A grand staircase curved upward through the center of the hall, while dark portraits watched silently from every wall. Somewhere deeper within the building, a grandfather clock ticked with slow and steady precision. Behind the reception desk stood a silver-haired man with calm eyes and perfect posture. He looked up as Arthur approached. "Good evening." "Arthur Pembroke." The man nodded once. "Welcome to the Belgrave Grand Hotel. I am Mr. Holloway. Do you happen to have a room available?" Mr. Holloway opened a large ledger and examined it in silence. A curious pause followed, long enough for Arthur to notice. Then the innkeeper closed the book. "One remains." Arthur smiled politely. "Excellent." Mr. Holloway reached beneath the desk and produced a brass key. Room 13. He placed it carefully upon the counter. Arthur immediately sensed something change within the room around him. Conversation drifting from the tavern beyond reception suddenly softened. A chair stopped moving. Someone glanced over from the doorway and quickly looked away again. Arthur picked up the key. Mr. Holloway spoke quietly. "If you prefer, I can recommend another inn nearby." Arthur glanced toward the windows where rain lashed against the glass. "No," he said pleasantly. "This will do perfectly." The innkeeper studied him for a long moment before nodding. "As you wish." Arthur had almost reached the staircase when another voice stopped him. "Excuse me, sir?" He turned. An elderly woman stood in the doorway leading into the tavern. She was small and gray-haired. Dressed in a dark apron and carrying a tray she seemed to have forgotten entirely. Her face looked kind, though deeply concerned. She offered him a gentle smile. "Would you care for tea before going upstairs?" Arthur hesitated briefly before accepting. Something told him the invitation was less hospitality and more warning. The tavern was warm and dimly lit, its low ceiling crossed with dark wooden beams blackened by decades of smoke. Several locals sat quietly beside the fire, though their conversations rarely rose above whispers. More than once, Arthur noticed someone glance toward him before quickly looking away. Miss Maple poured tea slowly into a small porcelain cup. For a time, she said nothing at all. Then, without looking up, she quietly asked, "Do you believe in spirits, Mr. Pembroke?" Arthur smiled. "I believe people often see what they expect to see." Miss Maple nodded faintly, as though the answer disappointed her very little. "Perhaps." She folded her hands in her lap. "Her name was Charlotte Evermore." The fire crackled softly nearby as rain beat against the tavern windows. "More than 2 centuries ago, Charlotte arrived at the Belgrave Grand Hotel with her husband, George Evermore. He was a merchant by trade and often traveled abroad for business. During one particular winter, he departed once again, promising to return before the first full moon of November." Miss Maple paused, but he did not return. Arthur listened quietly. At first, Charlotte waited patiently, then anxiously. Weeks became months, months became years. Eventually, the townspeople claimed George Evermore had died somewhere at sea or along the roads of the north. Yet Charlotte refused to believe it. Every full moon, she placed a candle in the window of room 13 so that George might find his way home should he arrive after dark. The woman looked away toward the ceiling above them. She waited many years. Arthur said gently, "And eventually she died there?" Miss Maple nodded slowly. "One winter night, during a violent storm very much like this one, the candle overturned beside her chair. The fire spread quickly. By the time anyone reached room 13, smoke had already filled the corridor." Her voice softened further. "When they opened the door, they found Charlotte sitting calmly beside the window, still waiting for George to return. The candle was burning beside her." For several moments, only the rain could be heard. Then Arthur smiled lightly. "And ever since then, her ghost walks the hotel?" Miss Maple looked directly at him for the first time. "No." Her expression remained strangely solemn. "Room 13 remembers." Arthur thanked her kindly for the tea and finally climbed the staircase. The corridor above seemed quieter than the rest of the hotel. Thick carpets muffled with footsteps while gas lamps along the walls flickered behind dusty glass. At the far end stood a single door bearing the brass number 13. Arthur unlocked it. The room beyond was larger than expected. A fire smoldered quietly in the hearth. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked countryside. A large bed stood against one wall beside dark Victorian furniture, polished to a dull shine by age. And near the window, upon a small round table, stood an elegant silver candle holder. The candle itself was old and slightly melted with age. Arthur removed his coat and unpacked slowly, amused by the entire affair. He had encountered similar stories before in isolated towns, eager to preserve local legends. Usually the mystery ended with hidden passageways or overactive imaginations. Yet, despite his reasoning, He could not deny that the room possessed an unusual stillness. Outside, the rain gradually weakened. Clouds drifted apart. Moonlight entered the room. Arthur sat beside the fire with a book in his hands and eventually lost track of time altogether. Then something caught his attention. The candle. At first he thought moonlight reflected strangely against the wick, but no. A faint orange glow had appeared at its tip. Not flame, only a dull ember-like glow, as though heat existed without fire. Arthur slowly lowered his book. The room had grown colder. The glow intensified gradually. Then, without warning, the candle ignited. Arthur stood immediately. No draft had touched it. No one had entered the room. Yet the flame now burned steadily upon the wick, casting long trembling shadows across the walls. He approached carefully. The air smelled faintly of smoke. Not candle smoke. Fire smoke. Old smoke. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Crossing the corridor outside. Arthur turned toward the door just as the handle moved gently on its own. The door opened. A woman entered. She wore a faded Victorian dress of dark lace. Her silver hair gathered neatly behind her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent within the candlelight, though not monstrous or frightening. She looked instead unbearably tired. She did not appear to notice Arthur at all. She crossed the room slowly and sat beside the window, looking outward into the moonlight, waiting. Arthur stared in stunned silence. Every logical explanation abandoned him at once. The woman finally spoke. "Has George returned?" Her voice sounded distant, soft as rustling paper. Arthur swallowed. "No." The woman lowered her eyes. "Then I must keep the candle burning." She remained seated beside the window while the candle flame trembled weakly nearby. Minutes passed. Arthur could not move. The room itself slowly began to change around him. Wallpaper darkened. The air thickened with smoke. The polished furniture appeared older, worn by another century entirely. Somewhere below, voices shouted faintly through distant corridors. Arthur realized with growing horror that he was no longer merely seeing a ghost. He was witnessing the night Charlotte Evermore died. The woman beside the window continued staring into the moonlight. "George promised he would return before winter," she whispered. "He always kept his promises." The smoke thickened further. Arthur stepped toward her carefully. "Charlotte?" For the first time, she turned toward him fully. Half her face remained untouched by time. The other half carried faint burns blackened by smoke and fire. Yet her eyes contained no hatred, only sorrow. Then suddenly, she looked confused, as though seeing Arthur clearly for the first time. "You are not him." Arthur's heartbeat thundered within his chest. No! The room groaned around them. Flames flickered suddenly along the curtains before vanishing again like memories repeating themselves. Charlotte lowered her gaze. He was only one night late. Arthur froze. What? Tears filled her pale eyes. One night. The candle flame beside her burned violently brighter, and suddenly Arthur understood. George Evermore had returned, but Charlotte had died before he arrived. The room had trapped the final moments of her waiting ever since. Arthur searched desperately around the changing room until his eyes fell upon a narrow writing desk near the wall. One drawer stood partially open beneath layers of soot and age. Inside lay an old letter, yellowed, unopened. Arthur pulled it free with trembling hands. The seal bore the initials G.E. The smoke thickened heavily around them now. The room crackled with phantom fire while Charlotte remained seated beside the window, still wading through centuries of grief. Arthur carefully opened the letter. The handwriting inside had faded with time, but the words remained legible. Charlotte, forgive me. The roads were blocked by snow beyond Dunwich Valley. I rode through the night to return to you. I am home. George. Arthur looked toward Charlotte. Very softly, he read the final line aloud. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the room became still. The flames vanished. The smoke disappeared. Charlotte Evermore slowly closed her eyes. A peaceful expression crossed her face for the first time. He came back. Arthur nodded silently. The old woman looked toward the candle, then gently blew out the flame. Darkness swallowed the room for one brief second. When the candlelight returned from the hearth, Charlotte Evermore was gone. Morning arrived quietly over the hills beyond the Belgrave Grand Hotel. Arthur descended the staircase shortly after sunrise, carrying his coat and traveling case. Mr. Holloway stood behind the reception desk exactly as before. The innkeeper looked at him carefully. You are leaving early. Arthur placed the old letter upon the counter. I believe this belongs to room 13. Mr. Holloway stared at the letter for a very long time before finally taking it into his hands. Then quietly, almost cautiously, he asked, Did the candle burn? Arthur looked toward the staircase. For several moments he said nothing at all. And then, yes. Mr. Holloway lowered his eyes. Arthur stepped toward the entrance. Just before he reached the door, Miss Maple spoke softly from the tavern doorway. And did she finally find peace? Arthur paused. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Pale morning light spread slowly across the countryside, while fog drifted gently among the distant trees. At last he answered, I believe she did. Then Arthur Pembroke left the Belgrave Grand Hotel behind him forever. Yet many years later, Whenever travelers passed through that forgotten part of the country during the night of a full moon, they still spoke quietly of Room 13. Not because the candle continued burning, but because some guests claimed that shortly before midnight, when the moonlight touched the old windows of the Belgrave Grand Hotel just so, they sometimes saw the faint outline of a woman sitting peacefully beside the glass, no longer waiting, simply watching the road at last grow empty. The Black Coachman. The rain began before Killian O'Connor reached Carrington Hill. At first it was only a fine grey mist clinging to the hedgerows, soft enough that the driver did not trouble himself to raise the carriage hood. The road wound between low fields and bare bending trees, and beyond them stood a wicker wood. Killian noticed it long before he saw the first cottage. The forest rose beyond the fields like a dark wall, old and dense and still beneath the troubled sky. Other woods had color, even in poor weather. Wickerwood had none. It was black, or nearly so, its branches knitted together in a mass so thick that the eye could not follow any single trunk for long. The driver glanced toward it once and then looked quickly away. "Bad weather coming," he muttered. Killian leaned back against the worn leather seat and drew his coat tighter about him. He was tired, damp, and in no mood to encourage rural unease. "I shall not be long," he said. "An hour at most." People often say that. Killian looked at him, but the man said nothing more. He had been sent from London to settle the final affairs of Lady Margaret Harrington, a wealthy widow who had died without close family. Killian had accepted the errand with no great concern. He would inspect the papers, confirm the seals, arrange for the necessary witnesses, and be back on the road before evening. That, at least, had been the plan. By the time the carriage rolled into Carrington Hill, the mist had become rain, and the rain had begun to strike the windows in hard, slanting lines. The village lay in a shallow dip beneath the forest's edge. Its cottages were low, grey, and close-set, with thatched roofs darkened by weather and narrow windows that seemed to watch without welcome. At the center stood a small inn with a crooked sign swinging above the door. The Crooked Wheel. The driver halted there, but Killian did not yet get down. "I was told Harrington House was beyond the village." The driver pointed with his whip toward a lane climbing eastward between two stone walls. "Quarter of a mile. Big house. You cannot miss it." "Will you wait?" The driver looked up at the sky. Thunder muttered beyond Wickerwood. "For an hour," he said. "No longer if this worsens." Killian stepped down in the rain and continued on foot. Harrington House stood at the edge of the village, set back behind iron gates and a short avenue of dripping yew trees. Its tall windows were shuttered. Its stone steps were slick with rain. One chimney leaned slightly against the darkening sky. Inside, the house smelled of dust and extinguished fires. An elderly caretaker admitted him without enthusiasm and said almost nothing while Killian completed his work. The papers were already laid out in the library. The keys were arranged in a neat row. The wax, ribbon, and ink had all been placed upon the table, as if someone had prepared not only for business, but for him. Killian found this efficient, if slightly peculiar. The house troubled him more. In the hall, a long case clock stood stopped at 11 minutes before midnight. In the drawing room, every mirror had been turned toward the wall, and above the library mantel hung a portrait of Lady Margaret Harrington. She had been painted in black silk, seated stiffly beside a window. Her face was thin, proud, and bloodless, with pale hands folded over a closed book. Behind her, almost hidden in the painted gloom beyond the glass, was a road leading toward the forest. Upon that road stood a black coach. Killian looked at it for some time. The caretaker, standing near the door, said quietly, "Her lady liked old stories." Killian turned. "What story is that?" The old man lowered his eyes. "Best ask at the inn, sir." Before Killian could press him, thunder cracked so sharply above the house that the windows rattled in their frames. The storm had arrived. By the time Killian returned to the Crooked Wheel, the village road was nearly underwater. The driver stood in the stable yard, speaking with the innkeeper beneath the shelter of an open shed. Both men turned as Killian approached, and the expression on the driver's face told him at once that something had gone wrong. "Well?" Killian asked. The driver shook his head. "Road's blocked." "Blocked how?" "Tree down beyond the bridge. A whole oak across it. Roots and all. No carriage gets through tonight." Killian stared at him. "There must be another road." The innkeeper answered this time. He was a broad, heavy man with a red face, small eyes, and hands that seemed more used to barrels than books. "There is no other road out of Carrington Hill after dark," he said. The wording struck Killian as odd. After dark? The innkeeper looked briefly toward the forest. "In this weather, I mean." "And you are?" Abel grinned. "I keep the inn." Killian was cold, wet, and increasingly irritated. "Then I require a room." Abel Grint nodded as though he had expected nothing else. Inside, the Crooked Wheel was warmer than Killian had expected, but not more cheerful. A low fire burned in the hearth. Rain battered the small windows. A few villagers sat with mugs in hand, speaking in tones so low that their conversation died altogether when he entered. Abel gave him bread, stew, and a narrow room upstairs. Killian ate little. The storm worsened. Wind pressed against the walls. Every now and then, thunder rolled across wicker wood and seemed to linger there, muttering among the trees. It was perhaps an hour later, as Killian sat near the fire drying the cuffs of his coat, that one of the tavern guests spoke. "You mean to leave tonight, sir?" Killian looked up. The man who had spoken was old, though not frail, with a face sharpened by years of weather and silence. Two others sat beside him. All three watched Killian with the same fixed attention. "I would leave if the road were clear," Killian said. "It is not." So I am told. The old man looked into the fire. Then stay indoors. Killian gave a thin smile. That seems excellent advice during a storm. The man lifted his eyes. Not because of the storm. The room became very still. Abel grinned, standing behind the counter, busied himself with a glass that did not require polishing. Killian waited. The old man said, "There are nights when the Black Coachman comes." A gust of wind struck the inn so hard that the shutters trembled. Killian leaned back slightly. The Black Coachman? Aye. And who is he supposed to be? No one answered at once. The other guests, younger than the first but no less pale, said, "He comes when the road is blocked, when a stranger is stranded." Killian looked from one face to another. The old man's mouth tightened. "And he says he knows another road." At this, Abel set the glass down too sharply. The sound made everyone glance toward him. Killian noticed. "What happens to those who accept?" The old man returned his gaze to the fire. "They do not arrive where they meant to go." Killian stood. "I am grateful for the entertainment, gentlemen, but I have legal matters awaiting me in London and no taste for village theater." The old man did not seem offended. He only said, "Then sleep through the knocking, if you hear it." Killian went upstairs. He did not sleep. Near midnight, the storm seemed to gather itself directly above the inn. Rain lashed the shutters. The chimney groaned. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed softly, though no one called out. Killian lay dressed upon the bed, listening with increasingly annoyance to the storm and to his own thoughts. Then he heard the wheels. At first they were very distant, a dull rolling sound beneath the rain. Then closer. Iron rims over wet stone. Slow. Measured. Coming through the village. Killian sat up. The sound stopped outside the crooked wheel. For several seconds there was only rain. Killian rose and opened his bedroom door. The passage was dark, but light showed faintly below. He descended halfway down the stairs and saw Abel Grind standing in the tap room with a candle in his hand. The tavern guests were there too, dressed and silent, as though none of them had truly gone home. Another knock sounded. Abel did not move. From outside came a voice, low, wet with the night.
"The gentleman requires the road."
Killian continued down the stairs. Abel turned sharply. "Do not open." Killian stopped at the bottom. "Is this your famous coachman?" No one replied. The voice came again, closer now.
"The gentleman requires the road."
Killian went to the door. Abel whispered, "Sir." There was something in his tone that might have been fear or shame. Killian lifted the latch and opened the door. The black coach waited in the rain. It stood a little beyond the inn steps, its lanterns burning a deep yellow that did not wave in the wind. The coach itself was large and old-fashioned, black with high wheels and dark curtains drawn inside the windows. 2 black horses stood before it. They snorted nervously and tossed their heads, and steam arose from their nostrils in the cold rain. Upon the box sat the coachman. He wore a long black coat and a tall hat pulled low. Rain streamed from the brim, hiding whatever face might have been beneath it. In one gloved hand he held the reins. In the other, a whip rested across his knee. Killian stepped out beneath the porch. "The road is blocked," he called. The coachman did not stir.
I know another road.
Behind Killian, the tavern remained silent. No one told him to go. No one told him to stay. Abel Grint's voice came at last, very low. "Best not keep him waiting, sir." Killian turned toward him. For one brief moment he saw the truth almost clearly. Not enough to understand it, only enough to feel its shape. Then pride did what fear could not. It pushed him forward. He crossed the yard, opened the coach door, and climbed inside. The door shut by itself. The coach moved at once. At first it passed through the village. Killian saw shuttered cottages, the churchyard wall, the narrow bridge, and beyond it, the great fallen tree lying across the road. Its roots stood black and tangled in the rain, torn up like a dead hand from the earth. The coach did not stop. It turned before the bridge onto a narrow lane Killian was certain had not been there that afternoon. The lane sloped toward Wickerwood. Killian struck the roof with his cane. "Coachman?" No answer. "Where are you taking me?" The reply came through the rain, calm as before.
Around the fallen tree.
The village lights vanished behind them. The road narrowed. Branches leaned over the coach, scraping softly along its sides. The storm changed. Rain still fell beyond the windows, silver and wild, yet he no longer heard it strike the roof. The horses snorted and shook their heads, but their hooves seemed strangely muffled, as if the road beneath them had softened into something other than earth. Then, the coach entered Wickerwood. The forest closed around them at once. It was not merely dark. Darkness in ordinary woods has depth and distance. This darkness felt crowded. The trees leaned inward, their trunks twisted into shapes almost human, their branches knitting overhead like fingers interlaced in warning. Blue lights drifted between the trunks, not lanterns, not candles. Small floating flames that moved against the wind and vanished whenever Killian stared too long. A pale face appeared in a hollow of a tree. Then another. Then a third, lower to the ground, with eyes too large and a mouth that widened slowly as the coach passed. Killian pulled the curtain shut. Something tapped on the glass from the outside. A child's laugh ran beside the coach. Not in the coach, beside it. Killian forced himself not to look. Then a small shape bounded along the roadside, crooked-backed and long-armed, keeping pace with the horses. It turned its head toward him and grinned. In the next flash of lightning, it was gone. The road did not bend. That was the worst of it. It ran straight through Wickerwood, as if drawn by a ruler, deeper and deeper, though the trees on either side moved like living things, and the forest changed with every yard. Faces watched from bark. Pale figures hung between branches like torn curtains. An old woman made of moss, twigs, and shadow stood beside a ditch and whispered,
Killian O'Connor.
He gripped the seat. The coach smelled suddenly of damp paper. On the cushion opposite him lay a bundle of documents. They had not been there when he entered. At first, in his confusion, he thought they were Lady Margaret Harrington's estate papers. He seized them with relief almost, as though legal order could restore ordinary reason. But these were not the same. The first sheet contained a list of dates. Every 19 years. Beside each date was a name. Some were faded, some written in brown ink, some looked almost fresh. Killian turned page after page. All strangers. All vanished during storms. All taken from Carrington Hill when the road was blocked. Then he reached the final page. There, beside the present date, written in wet black ink, was his own name. Killian O'Connor. He threw the papers aside and hammered on the floor. Stop! Stop now! The coachman did not turn. Killian pulled at the handle. It would not move. He struck the glass. Did not crack. The voice above him said,
Every village pays for its road.
Killian froze. What does that mean? The coach rolled on. What does that mean? The coachman answered only once.
Carrington Hill remembers its bargain.
At last, Killian understood enough to be afraid of more. The coach stopped in a clearing. The trees opened not kindly, but as a crowd opens to reveal what it has gathered to see. At the center of the clearing stood an enormous black tree, older and larger than any tree Killian had known. Its bark was rigged and pale in places, dark in others, as though made from many kinds of skin. From its branches hung ribbons, broken keys, strips of cloth, cracked spectacles, rusted buckles, and fragments of luggage. Around its roots stood old people, or what had been people. Men and women in clothes from many years and many fashions. A soldier with one sleeve torn. A maid with a traveling bag still clutched in both hands. An old man in a merchant's coat. A young boy in boots too large for him. All stood silent, half sunk into the ground, their legs vanishing into roots. Their faces had begun to change. Some were still human enough to be pitied. Others had bark growing over their cheeks. One woman opened her mouth as Killian stepped from the coach, but only dry leaves fell out. The black coachman climbed down. He seemed taller on the ground. His coat moved, though there was no wind in the clearing. He stood before Killian, hat brim still hiding his face.
Carrington Hill remains,
he said.
The road remains. Wickerwood takes one. That's the bargain.
Killian backed away. No! The coachman raised one gloved hand. The pale figure stirred among the roots. No! Killian said again and ran. The forest received him. Paths opened and closed. Branches reached for his coat. Roots rose under his feet. Blue lights flickered ahead of him, promising clear ground, then vanished over pools of black water. Small, crooked things ran through the undergrowth. He stumbled, fell, tore his hands on thorns, and rose again. Behind him, carriage wheels began to move. Slow, measured, patient. He ran harder. At last, through the trees, he saw lights. The village. For one wild moment, he believed he had escaped. Then he saw the lanterns. The villagers stood along the road in the rain. Abel Grint was among them. So were the tavern guests. Their faces were pale in the lantern glow, but none showed surprise. Behind them, the fallen tree had already been cut and dragged aside. The road lay open. It had never been meant to keep him in. It had been meant to call the coach. Killian staggered toward them. "Help me!" No one moved. He turned to Abel Grint. "You knew." The innkeeper could not meet his eyes. "You knew?" One of the older tavern guests spoke from beneath his hood. "The bargain is older than us." Killian stared at him. Rain ran down his face. "What bargain?" The man looked toward Wickerwood. Every 19 years, the forest takes one outsider. If it does not, it comes closer. Another guest whispered, "Fields die." Another said, "Children wander off." Abel Grint's voice shook. "Roots grow through floors. Doors open at night. Houses empty." Killian looked from one to the other. "You sent me." No one denied it. Abel swallowed. "We warned you." Killian laughed once, bitterly and without humor. "You call that mercy?" The old man by the road lowered his lantern. "It is part of the bargain." Behind Killian, the wheels stopped. The black coach waited at the edge of Wickerwood. The door opened. Inside, there was no seat now, only darkness, and the sound of trees moving in a wind too deep for the world above. Killian tried to run toward the open fields. The road shifted beneath him. Every direction bent back toward the coach. The villagers lowered their lanterns one by one. The Black Coachman said,
"The village has paid."
Something seized Killian from behind. Not hands. Roots. Cold, strong, and patient. He cried out once as they dragged him backward across the mud. The last thing he saw was Abel Grint standing in the rain with his face twisted in shame, doing nothing. Then the coach door shut. The wheels turned toward Wickerwood, and the storm swallowed them. In the morning, the road out of Carrington Hill was clear. The fallen tree lay neatly cut beside the ditch, though no one admitted taking an axe to it in the night. The storm had passed. The fields steamed beneath a pale sun. Carrington Hill stood dark and still beyond the village, its edge no nearer than before. Killian O'Connor's luggage remained in his room at the Crooked Wheel. His hat was found beside the stable yard. At Harrington House, the papers concerning Lady Margaret Harrington's estate were discovered sealed, signed, and arranged in perfect order upon the library table. The matter was concluded. No one in Carrington Hill spoke of him again. Weeks later, a traveler passing through the village noticed a young tree at the edge of Wickerwood. It had not been there before. Its bark was pale. Its branches hung like arms. And in the trunk, just beneath the grain, was the face of a young man, eyes wide and mouth open, as if he had seen another carriage coming and was trying, even now, to warn whoever sat inside. On storm nights when the road floods and thunder rolls above Wickerwood, the people of Carrington Hill close their shutters before midnight. They bank their fires, they lower their voices, and they do not answer when wheels are heard beyond the door. Slow, patient. For sometimes above the rain, the Black Coachman can still be heard calling softly from the road.
I know another road.
Well then, you've made it all the way to the end. Some listeners leave early. Some grow uneasy when the night grows too quiet. But you stayed. And if you enjoyed tonight's ghostly tale, feel free to like the video, share it with a fellow night wanderer, and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the lantern burning and the stories coming. Thank you for listening. Until we meet again for more short ghost stories, long after midnight.